Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a premium operational briefing. We're going to deconstruct the 1962 Sino-Indian conflict, but we're going way beyond just troop counts and lines on a map.
So what creates real military power? It's a question that totally challenges a basic assumption we all kind of have when we look at history, right? Do larger armies automatically win wars? Does just having a massive population or a huge roster of soldiers equal a guaranteed win on the battlefield?
Well, the crucial point here is that true combat capability isn't just a simple head count. It's actually a complex equation. You absolutely need four vital components: men, weapons, logistics, and intelligence. And they have to be working together seamlessly. If even one of these fails, the whole system just collapses. Let's dig into exactly how this mathematical reality played out during the incredibly harsh winter of 1962.
Right from the get-go, the disparity on the ground was literally staggering. You had the Chinese deploying 8 full divisions on the frontiers, plus another 4 just sitting in reserve. Down in places like West Kameng, they brought in the 21st and 54th Armies with multiple divisions. Now, contrast that massive presence with the heavily isolated Indian deployments. We're talking thinly spread formations, like the 114 Infantry Brigade in Ladakh, which had just 2 regular battalions and 2 militia battalions, or the 7th Infantry Brigade, basically standing totally alone at Namakachu until late October.
So why was there such a massive mismatch? It wasn't just a simple lack of foresight. It was actually rooted in some deep structural geopolitical roadblocks. China had this huge advantage of Soviet assistance throughout the 1950s, helping them build up their air force and military infrastructure. Plus, their civil administration was already hardened by years of conflict. India, on the flip side, was totally strapped by its non-alignment policy. They couldn't just go and secure Western arms without compromising their independent foreign policy. They were stuck navigating complex embargoes tied to the Kashmir issue in Pakistan, making them super dependent on old World War II-era imports. They just didn't have the foreign sterling reserves to go shopping for modern weapons on the open market.
And man, this geopolitical disadvantage quickly snowballed into an absolute operational nightmare. Just think about the reality of the Himalayas. The Indian 4 Mountain Division was essentially ordered into one of the highest battlefields on planet Earth. We are talking about sending troops straight into severe mountain terrain, freezing temperatures, and giving them almost no time to acclimatize. Because the region severely lacked transport infrastructure, most of their heavy equipment and firepower literally just had to be left behind down in the plains.
These logistical failures even extended down to the most basic human need: food. Now, if you know anything about mountain warfare, you know it demands a high-calorie diet. You also desperately need pressure cookers just to prepare meals at that high altitude. But instead, the Indian troops were supplied with lentils. That's a staple meant for the plains. They were practically impossible to cook up in the mountains without the right gear. Even the oil cookers they desperately needed for simple warmth and cooking were held up by what officials called administrative delays. I mean, just imagine trying to simply survive, let alone fight a war, under those conditions. The equipment deficit was just staggering, leaving the troops completely exposed. Battalions like the 9 Punjab and 2 Rajput were sent marching into sub-zero temperatures at Namkachu, wearing only cotton uniforms and an olive green jersey. They carried exactly 1 blanket each, and their primary weapon? The .303 Lee Enfield rifle, literally a relic from World War II. To make matters worse, they walked into a heavy combat zone with generally just 50 rounds of ammo per man. 50 rounds! That's enough to last maybe 30 minutes in an intense firefight. Even their comms were a disaster. They were stuck relying on these massive battery-heavy and PRC-9 radio sets that needed constant hand cranking just to keep a charge.
As you can imagine, the logistics chain holding this all together was agonizingly fragile. Because there were practically no usable roads, the Indian Army had to rely almost entirely on a convoluted airlift system to move supplies from the roadhead all the way to the forward posts. In the era of jet aircraft, their main mode of surface transport was literally mules and human porters. The helicopters they did manage to buy from Russia, completely unsuited for high-altitude operations and plagued by a severe lack of spare parts. 30%. That number right there is the ultimate tragedy of this whole supply chain. Because the terrain was so unforgiving, only 30% of the daily rations and supplies that were airdropped actually made it into the hands of the troops. The other 70% simply swallowed up and lost to the mountains. It left the frontline soldiers freezing and starving.
And adding to the total chaos on the ground was a chain of command that was deeply, deeply disconnected. You had HQ Eastern Command sitting hundreds of miles away in Lucknow, then HQ 33 Corps over in Shillong, and finally HQ 4 Corps, which was raised totally from scratch in Tezpur by Lieutenant General B.M. Cole in October 1962.
We're talking weeks, and in some cases just days, before the major clashes began. They were hastily trying to manage these desperately scattered forces from afar.
But here's the real kicker. This tactical chaos was compounded by a profound intelligence vacuum. It basically doomed the operation before a single shot was ever fired. When India gained independence, the departing British dismantled the external intelligence system and burned the crucial files. So the Intelligence Bureau was suddenly being run by untrained police officials under a former police officer named B.N. Mullick. They had zero military contacts and absolutely no agents inside Tibet or China. They were operating in a total void, basically just relying on whatever material British and American intelligence agencies decided to feed them.
This vacuum sparked an absolute strategic disaster. Because this police-run intelligence bureau was unwilling to coordinate with the army, use military signals, or even tap into the aerial recon capabilities of the Indian Air Force, their information gathering was completely siloed. This led to a massively flawed assessment in 1961, where they somehow concluded that the Chinese would simply back down if Indian posts were pushed forward. That one flawed assessment directly birthed the civilian government's incredibly risky forward policy.
Which brings us to a really shocking reality, pulled straight from the historical records. Incredibly, the IB was laying down tactical policy for the army. Just think about that for a second. You have a civilian intelligence bureau with absolutely no tactical training and zero human assets on the ground in Tibet dictating military placements. They completely bypassed military intelligence. They ignored stark warnings from Western Command that a full, heavily armed division was needed to counter the Chinese buildup. Instead, they pushed outmatched, completely unacclimatized troops forward into positions that were militarily impossible to defend.
So, the definitive lesson we absolutely have to take away from 1962 is this: prepared forces matter far more than large forces. The crippling logistics, the outdated World War II-era equipment, the lack of time to acclimatize, and that massive glaring intelligence gap, they completely canceled out any sheer numbers the Indian Army tried to throw at the problem. It wasn't just about the number of boots on the ground. It was about the fact that those boots were buried in snow, worn by troops freezing in cotton uniforms who were waiting for airdrops that were never going to arrive.
Which leaves us with a pretty important question to ponder. When you're looking at geopolitics today, when you're evaluating the military power of any nation anywhere in the world, are you just counting the numbers, or are you looking at the logistics, the weapons, the intelligence? Are you measuring the true combat capability? Hopefully this explainer gave you a sharper lens to view history in modern conflict. Thanks so much for joining me for this operational briefing, and I'll catch you next time.